Hello and welcome to the Periphery from the Pulaski Institution. I'm your host, Alan Elrod. And today we're doing another one of our episodes where we follow up on pieces in our 50 Takes on Democracy series. And we are joined this time by Dr. Luke Perry. Luke Perry is a professor of political science at Utica University and director of the Utica University Center of Public Affairs and Election Research. His recent books include the 2020 presidential election, Key Issues and Dynamics, the 2020 Democratic primary, Key Lessons, Dynamics, and Lessons for 2024, and Donald Trump and the 2018 midterm battle for Central New York. And Luke wrote for us on the state of New York. His piece on our website is titled Ever Upward Vigilance Through Troubled Times in the Empire State. And thank you so much for joining us, Luke.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start, I think, this time by just coming back to the piece. And this is one of our more, so far, I think, optimistic pieces. You assess kind of the collateral of some of the Cuomo scandals. And the conclusion you come to is actually, I think, pretty sunny in light of everything, at least, that ultimately New York's institutions and democracy appear pretty resilient. So I think in light of that, kind of through the pandemic, through the Cuomo scandals, I'm curious now that it's been not an incredibly long time, but just a little bit of time, a few months at least since the piece dropped. If you're still feeling as good about democracy in the state of New York, maybe as you did when you wrote the piece, or if you're feeling better, kind of just to come back to where you're at and see how you feel about what you put down for us.
I think it's all relative. New Yorkers are pretty jaded about many things, including politics. So I certainly don't want to underestimate that. But I think when my piece came out, it was a turning point for statewide leadership, with Governor Cuomo coming and going as tumultuously as he did, Lieutenant Governor Hochul stepping in and being reasonably well received for the most part during her tenure, and then obviously facing an election contest. So last year was an election year. Unlike, I would say, other states around the country, New York's electoral system is relatively strong. It's not experiencing some of the other problems, proximate problems that we've seen in other states. There are longstanding issues, but when we think about democracy, those types of things are not as much of a concern. And we did see Governor Hochul become the first woman elected to be governor of New York, which is a historical and monumental change in New York history. On the other hand, when we talk about the being jaded and the cynicism, there was also a protracted dispute over redistricting in New York, lawsuits, and sort of continuation of issues that the state has had in the past in terms of drawing boundaries, particularly gerrymandering. And so that also was another major development last year that was not positive when it comes to democracy or the Democratic Party, which is obviously prominent in New York.
I want to get to the redistricting in a moment, obviously, because we know that New York played a pretty crucial role in the GOP taking the House back, and I want to get to that, and obviously to the now I think almost ever present George Santos. But I think for people who are less familiar, I'd love to dig in a little bit, talking here in a moment about political culture in New York, because I think most people, they probably think of New York City. And if they don't only think of New York City, they might think of New York City plus the kind of Rust Belt cities of like Buffalo and around where you are, Utica. But could you, I think, for people who are less familiar, especially because Pulaski talks so much about heartland areas, break down kind of the dynamics of New York politics that are not New York City a little bit. I know that Hochul had a relatively competitive race, and that might have surprised some people. I say relatively right. It was for a pretty deep blue state, and then I think just in general, so people maybe understand how it is that a place like New York could play a role in facilitating the GOP taking the House, because I think that might be one of those things where people weren't super surprised to hear that a state like Florida was part of that or anything. But I think there are a lot of Americans whose political imagination of New York uh, maybe at best captures New York City and Buffalo, probably really only captures New York City. So if you could just kind of give us the lay of the land of New York in a more holistic way, I think that would be good for people.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And as someone who went to high school in suburban New York City in North Jersey, I thought of upstate New York as one thing. And having lived here for several years now, you realize that once you get out of New York City, upstate New York is comprised of many different regions. And as a whole, it's much more Midwest, I would say, in terms of the mix of urban, suburban, and rural, as well as the political attitudes, as well as the political competition, than it is Northeast liberal that you would associate New York City with, to a lesser extent, the surrounding suburbs. So that's how I would cast upstate generally. And then uh, you could break it into different regions, right? So you got the Hudson Valley coming north out of New York City. Then you've got the capital region around Albany. And then you go north of that, you're in what you call the North Country that goes all the way up to Canada. And then if we think of upstate moving sort of west from there, you've got central New York, where I am, Utica, Syracuse, and that extends out to western New York, where the second largest city, Buffalo, is all the way in the other corner of the state. So that's just an example of a handful of regions you could break upstate into. And I think each region has its own sets of challenges, and that very much shapes politics, particularly when we think of state and local politics, and to a lesser degree, congressional politics, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I'll confess my obvious New York regional bias. I was in graduate school at NYU, and so I mostly lived in Brooklyn, and then I did a little bit where I lived in Westchester County, up on the Hudson in Ossining, right where the prison is, uh, which I didn't know until I moved there. And then I took my train it goes like under the prison walls when you go into the city, which is a really odd experience. Um, but yeah, I think that's a really helpful explanation, especially the idea that how much of the state can feel Midwestern economically and culturally, because there is that, right, that sense of and it's a lot of my dad's side is from Pennsylvania, and it's not that different than the like what the old like kind of James Carville adage, right, that Pennsylvania is Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between, or sometimes people say with Kentucky in between, right, that there's these states in like the mid-Atlantic where when you get away from the urban core, you're not dealing with the traditionally like deep blue that you have in maybe New England or those places. So I think that's a really interesting insight. So um, when we think about the redistricting process, I guess that gets us into this. What were some of the initial challenges there for the Democratic Party? Because obviously there was some of this, I think, is probably just pushback against the Cuomo legacy. And I think that's sort of what I would be interested from an insider perspective in New York in terms of how to parse this, right? How much of this pushback in New York, in terms of this Republican mini wave that happened there, is about sort of strategic, redistricting fights, and Republicans came out with some good districts, and how much of it is more attributable, do you think, to a kind of lingering dissatisfaction with the Cuomo years or frustration with perceived corruption and things like that?
That's an interesting question. I think the House election is not a referendum on Cuomo or a hangover of his legacy, uh, except for the fact that before Cuomo left office, he was instrumental in changing the system for how the state would redraw boundaries as it had to following the last major census, and it created an independent commission that was responsible for doing this. And it was kind of a long, convoluted system that frankly didn't work very well. And so this was created per amendment to the state constitution. And the relevant change was important in terms of creating the commission, and then also in terms of prohibiting gerrymandering in somewhat explicit language. And so when it came time for New York to have to redraw House boundaries, this commission system pretty quickly broke down. And the way the process then worked was it got kicked to the legislature, who ultimately were able to redraw the boundaries. And the Democrats in the state legislature pretty quickly and pretty aggressively drew the districts in their favor. And that led to a lawsuit by the Republicans, who ultimately won per that language I just mentioned in terms of gerrymandering. And then you had a special master come in and create the districts. And those new districts were not kind to Democrats, both in terms of how the map previously existed and what they hoped to do. And so you saw Republicans do very well in House elections here in New York. And I think the new boundaries were a major part of that story. And I think Democrats deserve criticism and at the state level for overreaching, frankly, because I think they could have created boundaries more in their interest without prompting this legal battle that they ultimately lost. So I think that was one contextual variable that was important. And then I also think when I look at New York State politics, particularly in regards to House elections, but to a lesser extent in the state legislature as well, Donald Trump was great for the Democratic Party in New York. And they really, from 2016 all the way up to 2020, just about maximized their power, both at the state and congressional level. And I think what you saw this election with President Biden's first midterm was a little bit of the correction back in a more Republican direction, which was exacerbated by this redistricting problem that the Democrats had. So I understand those two variables to be most impactful in trying to make sense of why the Republicans did well.
So, I mean, there's a couple different side streets I'd love to chase with you from that. One of them would, I think, naturally take us into talking about Santa. So I want to pause there and say first, I'm curious because some of this, which you just kind of got at, which is some of the Republican success in New York this time around, was really because the districts were essentially kept from being too partisan, right? And I think this exposes like one of the key problems right now in gerrymandering more broadly in the United States, right? Which is that you have blue states where some form of mechanism has been implemented, right, in order to actually try to make districts slightly more fair. And then red states where that's not happening as much. And I think that is one of the key things that's in the kind of general scrum of the debate right now about fairness and democracy, which is there's a lot of people say, well, gerrymandering is really bad. And then other people will say, well, yes, it's really bad, but you can't sort of unilaterally disarm. In this case, you've described, right, the actual Democrats in the New York legislature did kind of go for it. But they are still operating in a place where it sounds like sort of the institutional framework has moved towards fairness in districting, and therefore Republicans were able to step in there. I guess the thing that this makes me wonder is what is the kind of mentality right now more broadly among New York Democrats about this issue, this challenge of they are one of the states that in theory, right, if New York or California, or if some of these places, well, California can be pretty aggressive, but if New York gerrymandered perhaps as aggressively as, Maryland does for Democrats, or as some of the deep South states do for Republicans. That obviously could be very helpful at the national level for a party that is struggling with things like geographic concentration and other things like that. But then it's become more and more of a principle of Democratic Party politics to be opposed to gerrymandering in all cases. So I'm curious what the kind of internal party dynamics are like in the New York Democratic Party with regards to redistricting and how the party should be approaching that, reconciling those kinds of different challenges to the national party.
I think Democrats faced a lot of national pressure to use gerrymandering, redistricting to their advantage in a gerrymandered fashion. So they certainly found themselves in this national landscape where that was expected of them being a liberal state, trying to offset some of these other things you mentioned around the country. I think there were problems with that. The state constitution being first and foremost. And, interestingly enough, hearing from other people about this, one point a scholar suggested to me, well, why didn't just the Democrats just ignore the courts and do what they wanted, right? And my reaction was kind of taken aback by that, not only for legal process reasons, but because the way politics worked in New York, with Democrats having so much control, these judges that ruled against the Democrats and in the Republican favor on this redistricting case were largely put into power by Democrats. So, there isn't this overwhelming agreement on the Democratic Party on how to interpret the law when it comes to this particular issue. And obviously, judges are, by the design of their job, not trying to rule, at least overtly, hopefully not all, in a partisan way. And so I think that was one hangup. And then there's obviously the blatant hypocrisy. If you have people like Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at the federal level trying to pass legislation to prevent gerrymandering, while in his home state, they're trying to gerrymander, that is not a winning message, and it's very easy for Republicans to poke holes in that, which they did. So, liberals will say, well, you've got to fight that way, and you got to gerrymander in Democratic states to counter gerrymandering Republican states, even if you think it's wrong, because that's the way the game's played, until you change the game. But I think to the extent that people at large are following this, they could see that doesn't add up. You can't say something is horribly wrong and then say, well, you got to do it, though, until the law changes. So I just think it was not a good situation for Democratic Party politics all the way around. They either had to make a choice: are they going to stand on substance and do what they think is right, or are they going to play the game? And they tried to play the game and they lost.
So I think that's a good opportunity to flip it and ask some questions about the New York Republican Party, which to me is a really fascinating state level party in terms of the very complicated kinds of things it has produced over time, right? Like, obviously, if we go back, right, in the 20th century, one of the most iconic, New York Republicans would be with Rockefeller, and he's kind of the Rockefeller Republican is this moderate, even liberal in some contexts, form of republicanism that was finally kind of pushed out right during the Reagan years. You had when he was there, William Buckley, right, running actually on the conservative party ticket, right, because the Republican Party in many ways in New York State at the time wasn't as right leaning as he would have liked. And even today, we have kind of those weird complexities, I think, right, where you have someone like Elise Stefanik, who has become now a kind of avatar of Trumpism and MAGA, but who for the bulk of her early days and when her star first rose was kind of seen as someone who might pull the party back in the direction of a more moderate wing. And then obviously there have been quite a few other candidates who have expressed, on the other hand, quite a lot of extremism. I mean, I don't think Lee Zeldin, who ran against Hochul, was not a particularly moderate candidate. There have been some really, really hard right Republicans out of central and western New York. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that interesting tension that exists, where on the one hand, I think the New York Republican Party has frequently produced some of the more well-known moderates over the last 50 years of American politics, and at the same time managed to be a hotbed for some particular forms of extremism. Again, we could also mention, I think, Rudy Giuliani, who I think there's been a little bit even of a willingness to reassess his legacy as mayor in light of the sort of person he's become in the last decade or so, with an understanding that maybe some of those tendencies toward autocratic politics and ruthlessness were always more prominent than maybe given credit for initially. So I think it's. I'm curious if you speak a little. We just talked about the Democrats too, those kind of fissures and dynamics within the Republican Party in terms of state politics and how that plays out.
Sure. And connecting that back to what we were talking about geography in New York State politics, obviously New York City is overwhelmingly Democratic, but there is a pocket of strong Republican support on Long Island, and that's where, as you mentioned, Lee Zeldin is from, and Republicans did well on Long Island in this recent congressional race. And then throughout upstate New York, it's pretty much all red. It's predominantly rural, except for these strings of urban/suburban pockets that you also mentioned earlier. Albany, Utica, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo. If you were looking at a map, upstate is very large geographically, and that's where you'd see the blue pockets in those urban suburban areas, and the rest of it would be pretty red. The most conservative part of upstate New York would be the North Country, which is the most rural, up towards the Adirondacks and the Canadian border. It's been interesting. I think throughout this century, the notion of the Rockefeller Republican in New York has died. It is gone. I think some of that was in the making with the Tea Party movement pre-Trump, and then I think when the Trump version of the Republican Party came along, that was it for the Rockefeller Republican. And when you mentioned Elise Stefanik, I mean, I think she's a great example of someone who came up in sort of the Bush faction, worked closely with Paul Ryan, and then just made a decision to go all in and became more like Claudia Tenney, who is also sort of a notorious upstate conservatives or some of the rhetoric she's used. And it's been fascinating to me seeing Stefanik become more like Tenney rather than the other way around in the last few years. And where does that leave moderate Republicans? It leaves them at home, retired. I think of people like Richard Hanna, who represented the 22nd district for some time, pro-business, conservative, business owner himself. And when it came time to decide whether to endorse Trump or not, he couldn't do it, and then was basically forced out of the Republican Party, decided not to run. Similarly, John Katko, who's represented the Syracuse area and was moderate Republican, was able to elections across both Democratic and Republican administrations, was put in the position of having to vote on whether to impeach Donald Trump. And he was one of the few Republican House members to do so, and then ultimately decided, like Hannah, not to run for re-election because it's just so difficult envisioning what a primary would be like. And we can't underestimate also in thinking about extremism the personal threats to these people's safety, like Congressman Katko. I mean, if you go out and you're a Republican and you're impeaching a Republican president in a hyper-partisan environment where political violence has reared its ugly head more than we've seen in the recent past, I mean, you're putting yourself out there not only for political backlash, but for routine death threats to you and your family. And even as someone who's a former federal prosecutor like John Katko was, I'm sure that's not something you want to deal with on a day in, day out basis. So I think when I look at the Republican Party in upstate New York, where it's strongest, I don't see it bouncing back into more moderate fashion. I see it becoming more like Alabama, as you referenced earlier, and Pennsylvania. And that really hasn't been the norm for some time.
Okay. I think that gives a really interesting way then to, because we're talking about the dynamics between how the party is changing in terms of its electorate and its politics, and then also how the party establishment and even maybe leaders are leaving or falling away. When we look at George Santos. I don't necessarily want to get into, all the kookiness of his lies and his strangeness. Um, but what I do think it raises questions about in our conversation is how how on earth, in a way, does somebody like this get through the party structures and systems, right? This is a guy who just took a seat in a competitive district, right? His district essentially includes sort of the far eastern reaches, right, of Queens, and then parts of Long Island, but it is the rest of Long Island, I should say, because that's where Queens is. But it's not as if he just kind of floated by in some sort of overlooked, like, a safe seat, right? Like, to me, it asks some questions. Obviously, it asks some questions about the local press. It asks some questions about the DCCC and their capacity to do, you know, effective oppo work or things like that. But it also raises questions about the Republican Party in the state and locally there on Long Island in terms of how someone like this ends up the nominee and now the sitting congressman. Uh, so I was curious if you could speak a little bit to that.
Sure. Certainly, it's drawn national attention, unfortunately, for New York. I think, as I mentioned before, Long Island has a pretty strong Republican contingent. I think with Lee Zeldin on the ticket, that's one of the reasons that so many Republicans did well in that region. They rode his coattails. And so I'll work kind of backwards. From the general election, you had incumbent Democrats in that area who read the writing on the wall. And so I'm just going to retire rather than fight it out here. So it was a prime area for Republicans to do well, that being Long Island. And I think Zeldin had a lot to do with it. He as you mentioned before, ran a pretty strong campaign, ran on a message that resonated. And I think that helped Republican candidates in the House across the board, but particularly on Long Island. So how did Santos get into that position? He's charismatic, and he was able to raise a lot of money early on. And I think obviously now there's been legal questions about how he raised that money and where it came from, which I think seems like it's going to haunt him. But I think that combination, in short, helped Santos secure the nomination. And then the larger context of New York State politics, you look at somebody like Elise Stefanik, who's a major player when it comes to the Republican House delegation, and particularly trying to help Republicans get elected. I think one of the reasons you haven't seen her come out against Santos or Speaker Kevin McCarthy was because they campaigned for him. They helped raise money for him, in addition to wanting to obviously retain the narrow overall House majority. And so if they were to come out against him now, that's going to make them look bad politically. Though you have had local Republicans in Long Island, party leaders come out and do that. You've had some newly elected Republicans in the House come out and say Santos this time. And you mentioned local press. Local press were raising questions about this. And just recently, some national publications pointed this out, such as the Washington Post, where they said, hey, as this whole Santos thing blew up, local papers were digging into some of the numbers and doing some of that. It was watchdog journalism more than obviously Democratic oppo research. But they were raising these questions that just wasn't getting the traction to impact people's perceptions. And so I don't blame the local press for this one. I think it's more of the political circumstances that put Santos in this position. And I don't see how he holds on to the seat. I mean, it's a surprise to me that McCarthy gave him committee assignments. I would think you're trying to process that strategically. Maybe you create some distance from him, at least put the appearance of having some punitive response to what's going on, but to completely embrace him. Majority of New Yorkers think that he's not fit for office. I don't see how he could possibly win re-election. That's all setting aside sort of what he did being unethical, and he's unfit for office. So it is quite a mess all the way around, certainly for Republicans right now.
I have a kind of two things I want to, I guess, kind of get at as we get towards the back end of the conversation, which is, and they're related, which is, one, I want to think about how New York and it's interesting to me because this is a podcast so much about heartlands and away from traditional centers, but it's also sort of fascinating to me how New York is this very large state, the home of America's biggest city and America's financial center, and really, in many ways, epicenter of a lot of American business and cultural life. How New York has, in that way, actually, especially relative to the stretch right from the Civil War through to FDR, kind of underperformed in its production of big time right national politicians. And then in light of that, the fact that the most prominent and powerful national politician New York has produced in the last 20 years has been he doesn't live there anymore, right? And Donald Trump, and how New Yorkers on a more maybe day-to-day political level relate to that reality or view Trump in relation to New York and as a Trump as a production of New York, as a kind of in many ways, right, a creature of New York, because he I think that's one of the things is that he really is. He may have moved to Florida. He seems to find Florida to be ideal for him in some ways, but he also is just extremely a product of and creature of New York. So I think maybe the Trump aspect I'd like to discuss first, and then after dwell a little on just the ways in which New York maybe for such a large state, both in terms of its actual population and in terms of the shadow it casts on American life, hasn't produced as many significant leaders, at least in the last half century, as one might would think.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I guess it all comes down to how you define leaders. Certainly, presidents and presidential candidates have been more limited. I agree with you there. And 2016 was very interesting in that regard because you had Donald Trump and you had Hillary Clinton, who was a New Yorker too, served as a U.S. senator here. Obviously, that's not necessarily where her roots are from or where she lived with her husband Bill Clinton, but the Clintons are very much for the latter part of their lives New Yorkers, and
Let's see,
so
you're speaking to an Arkansan, and will never not claim Bill and Hill.
fair enough, fair enough. So maybe we'll say there's dual perceptions of where they're connected with and where they live now. But that's a fair point. And then I look at Congress, and I think of Chuck Schumer, who I mentioned, Hakeem Jeffries now with the leadership position in the House, being the next generation there. Elise Stefanik, who we talked about, who's a leader, a very high up leader in the Republican Party. So I don't know. When I think back the last 5 years, I think there has been a rise of prominent New Yorkers in leadership positions. Though your larger point is well taken, and you mentioned Trump in particular. I think because of upstate New York being so predominantly rural, I think Trump's message really resonated there. I don't know how much of that is his New York City persona, though some of the bravado probably relates well, particularly to older white men. I think a lot of Trump's appeal, from my vantage point, had to do with how he was able to use reality TV to cultivate an image of himself as a highly competent business person, and that coupled with his campaign to focus on American nationalism and present himself as a political outsider. I don't think upstate New Yorkers were looking at Trump and saying he's a New Yorker and I relate to that part of him. I think it was more other elements of his cultivated personality. But certainly, I don't want to understate the extent to which Donald Trump has been popular in rural upstate New York. And when we think about the size and the geography, I mean, this is farm country, dairy farms in particular, apple farms. And New Yorkers do have, particularly in the Rust Belt area and rural area, do have this psyche that New York's best times were about 100 years ago. And they don't look at government as being part of the solution in fixing things, this particular contingent who lament this. They look at it as part of the problem. And I think it feeds into conservatism in the sense that they don't look at change as a good thing. And they want to preserve what is left of the status quo because so much has gone in terms of businesses, in terms of economic opportunity, in terms of public works, that all of those businesses and money brought in, and people leaving the area to go elsewhere, including their kids when they grow up. People aren't able to find workers on the farm and maintain familial traditions that way. So I think there's a lot of pain in that story for a lot of people, and Trump put a voice to the anger that went along with that pain in rural America, upstate, and I think that explains the contingent. Again, I don't want to. I think it gets over caricatured that all rural Republicans in upstate New York are pro-Trump. They're not. There's a divide over Trump, but the ones that have stuck with him passionately, I think those are some of the dynamics and themes that help explain that.
I'm really glad that you said what you just said about central and upstate New York, because it's something that, when we talk at Pulaski about this idea of the heartland, we're trying to really convey something that's less sort of fixed in place, in the sense of the way people typically maybe think of just the geographic middle, right? We very much are trying to convey the idea that these places in, upstate New York and in, Eastern Oregon, or in the places away from like coastal Maine, are also places where some of those dynamics, right, of like you said, maybe cynicism, a sense of being left behind, a sense of frustration, right, of dislocation, and also where, like you said, it's not uniform, but where some of this populism has taken root. I'm curious, this is less of a question in terms of political science expertise, but I just think it's so fascinating to think about some of this stuff in New York when you contemplate the realities of especially Western and Central New York as a kind of pretty frequent hotbed of fervent and frankly kind of like frothy politics, right? Spiritualist movements and Oneida community, Joseph Smith, right? A lot of revival movements. I find that to be such a fascinating thing. I think a lot of people don't, unless they know the actual specific historical fact, right, think of New York as the place where so many of those things would actually have been born. But it is just such an interesting legacy. And I wonder how tangible that is sometimes still in the state when you're living there and moving around there.
That's a really interesting question. What comes to mind is this idea of upstate New York as the northern frontier, right? I mean, it is we are pretty remote here in terms of where we're located geographically. And I wonder the extent to which that played a role. Because when you think of Western development, and mentioned Joseph Smith and the Mormon Trail and their development of Utah, which wasn't a state at the time, it spoke to me of themes of escape, experimentation, and I think when you think about what types of dynamics tend to cultivate that geographically, I think it's more remote locations on the edge of the status quo. And so upstate New York, I mentioned the North Country, we are on that edge. And I think you look back over U.S. history and different trends of social developments and experimentation. I think that frontier rural mindset with relative geographic isolation, I think created perhaps some space for these types of things to happen over time. And it's definitely helps explain at least the identity of the different regions I mentioned upstate and the dynamics of how people upstate think differently than downstate, for instance, or other places around the country.
That's really interesting. Cool. So the thing I like to ask as a kind of just conversation piece at the end, as a chatter kind of thing, is whenever I have someone on, because we're sort of focused on this idea of places away from traditional centers and stuff like that, I like to ask, if I was in Utica for a weekend and you could recommend, could be a restaurant, could be a place, a natural scenery type place, a state or national park, could be a a movie theater, an old or a museum, or whatever it is. What is something that I might not initially realize I could go do that you would be like, well, you got to do this. If you're in Utica for 48 or 72 hours, you need to do this thing to enjoy this place and get a cool memory out of it.
Well, that's a great question. I think food comes to mind. Certainly, as with many places, their identity is in part connected to food. And Utica, like many cities, is divided into different neighborhoods with different culinary traditions. So um, I would encourage you to get some very good Italian food that you can find at several different restaurants in Utica, and they're more the mom rather than the big fancy restaurants that have come in, which are quite good in their own right with the development of the new downtown hospital and other economic redevelopment issues. I mean, it's really the mom and pop sort of Italian restaurants that come to mind that I think would be worthwhile to explore if you were in the area. And yeah, it's so hard to answer that question concisely and give you one thing. But since you mentioned food, I figured I'd jump on that. And then the other thing I would just share more generally is one of the things that blows my mind about Utica is that you can be in the middle of the historic city 1 minute, and then you drive 10 minutes and you're in, an array of different suburbs, some with sort of conventional modern shopping, like New Hartford, others like where I live in Clinton, New York, which is an old New England type village town that dates back 400 years. So you have not just suburbs, but a real variety in terms of past and present in the suburbs. And then you drive 10 more minutes and you're in dairy country, like I mentioned before. And you have rolling hills and beautiful scenery and all types of recreational opportunities that soon abut the Adirondacks, which is a great undiscovered wonder for a lot of people. So, because I somewhat failed to provide good specifics, I'll maybe leave it with the general of how I think this area is a microcosm for the United States in a relatively small, condensed area where you can have such a different urban, suburban, rural experience. And I've lived all over the country and in different parts of the world, and I haven't had much opportunity to encounter all that in a relatively small space. And that's one of the things that really stands out to me that I think is unique and interesting about Utica and the surrounding area.
It definitely makes me want to plan a central / upstate New York road trip. Dr. Lee Perry, thank you so much for being with us. His piece, like I said, can be found at pulaskiinstitution.org under our 50 Takes on Democracy series. And we're going to be putting out more of those, both pieces and these interviews all throughout the spring. So thank you to everyone who has been listening to this, and we hope that you will come back for another. And thank you, Luke.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for all that you do. This is a fascinating series.
Well, thank you so much. All right. Have a good day.
You too.
The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.